Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla, and on this episode I have Wilfred Reilly. Will is a political scientist, he's a tenured professor, and he has written a handful of books about hate crime and taboo and just race in general. And in this episode, we talk about the current statistics on racial groups in the United States. We talk about how to understand the media perception with the actual data on race. There seems to be almost two competing universes, if you will, where there's some of the data about race in the United States, and then there's what you get on social media, you get turned on the TV, and there seems to be a whole other set of data points. And so we try and sift through some of that. We talk about why Will is skeptical about systemic racism, at least currently, and some of his beliefs on that. We talk about the differences between equality and equity, and what the differences are and why that's important. We talk about the differences between quantitative and qualitative studies. Will is a pretty hard quantitative guy and has some charitable things to say about qualitative stuff and how both are necessary for understanding experiments in the world and about people. And then we talk about the current state of politics in the United States and what that looks like and how we can move forward. Will is just a wealth of information. He's got so much data. He's got so many wonderful points to tell us and express. And, I learned a lot from listening to him and engaging with him. And I really, really enjoyed this conversation and think these are the types of conversations we need to have about these topics. And so now I bring you Wilfred Reilly. I am here with Wilfred Reilly. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, you are.
How's it going, man?
It's going pretty well. Like I said in the intro, a lot of meetings, talking to students about their grades. They're all surprised not to be A students this year. Talking to some of my buddies. I mean, like my friends have had almost ethical conversations about what to do during COVID for NYE. So I mean, a lot of time on the phone or on Zoom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's 2020. I mean, that's kind of how it's been. It's I feel like when I talk to clients or even for myself, there's so many more meetings. It feels like more things, to kind of meet with people. And so I don't know. It's kind of been the year this year, but.
Yeah, I do think that one thing that it's kind of illustrated. I mean, there was an old joke by the Dilbert guy who's now politically active for whatever reason. But I mean that in a day of executive work, you do about an hour and a half of actual work. And to some extent, now that that's broken out across these meetings, or you need to get a project in online at a certain time, I mean, you can see that that's kind of true.
Mm-hmm.
I've tried to step that up. I've made myself, while we're doing this, do 2 hours a day of actual writing, public intellectual or academic writing. Like I go to the gym or the dojo every day when that's open.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that at least has been a benefit, but just realizing how much of what you do can be condensed into a 20-minute online conversation has been pretty interesting. I don't know if we're going to get back to what we were doing before, where everyone commutes in for 2 hours to downtown Chicago or Louisville in my case, and you sit there and you make your 3 sales calls for the day, and then you figure out what you're going to do the rest of the day. I mean, I think that may be an old form that we're getting past.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was a way of, we were trying to figure out, I know a lot of people didn't like the whole open space kind of workplace. And so I can't imagine we do that again. And so I think working from home or remotely or some form of that will probably be in the future, probably as kind of a staple of how we do work nowadays. But
yeah, one of the unspokens in the whole COVID debate, interestingly enough, has been, and I really feel this has been bad for blue collar people. I'm not totally sympathetic here, but has been people realizing how much they hated work. I mean, my background before, going into academia was kind of that bullpen sales floor, trading floor sort of sector with, the shouting boss and 15 guys barking into phones. And I know that a lot of my buddies, fairly tough guys that are still in that sector, are glad to be home. Like with no one bullying them, like not every, dollar they earn going up on a giant board. So I think there's going to be a lot of resistance to being dragged back, $30 gasoline commute to go to a place where people are mean to you. Basically, I think there's going to be pretty strong resistance to that.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Yeah, I would agree with that. So it will be interesting. Okay, so why don't you tell listeners who you are, a little bit of background on yourself, and what you do currently, and any future projects you're getting into.
Yeah, so I'm Wilfred Reilly. I am an associate professor of political science. Got tenure a little under a year ago at Kentucky State
Congrats!
University.
Congrats!
Thank you. Yeah, but I mean that's one of the many well-known historically Black colleges in the country. It's actually an interesting institution because it's an HBCU in Appalachia. We're
Hmm.
within 30 minutes of the Appalachian foothills, the Rise, it's called. And that's actually one reason I went there. I figured it'd be a good chance to help some kids that were obviously highly intelligent at the state U, but were maybe first generation college kids. I'm, as you're expected to be, as an academic who doesn't want to get fired, an author. In addition to some wonk stuff and some pieces for public intel journals like Commentary, I'm the author of the books Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. And that's pretty much it in terms of professional profile. I mean, in terms of background, I grew up in Chicago, which I still consider to be the greatest city in the world. Currently living in downtown Frankfurt, the Kentucky state capital, Southern Illinois University for the PhD, and most of my other degrees, University of Illinois College of Law for a JD, which, as it turns out, I don't use. There's nothing worse than being a young lawyer till about age 30, for those listening. I mean, war or something like that. But in terms of jobs, it's going to be miserable and unrewarding. But at any rate, my interests include Pan-Asian cooking, beer, archery, and basketball.
Hey, that sounds like you completely well-rounded. Look at that. You got the academic
fun
side.
Person, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly sounds like it. Okay, so a few things on the item list here. I would be remiss if I got you on here, we didn't talk about race. I know that's what you probably talk about often. So I've had a few people on here on this podcast that we've had different aspects of that conversation. I've had Rod Graham on here. I've had Brittany King on here. And I have a few other people that are going to come out probably next month that I've already recorded that have also talked about this as well. And so I guess for your perspective, because you're doing political science, right? And you're doing political science in the United States on I know you touch on race relations, and so maybe just to set us up, we're recording this at the the last day of the year, and it's been quite an interesting year for a lot of reasons. The pandemic, obviously, but then also race became, especially during the summer, kind of the highlight of the spotlight of everybody's mind. And just, when thinking back this year and the past couple years, where do you think it accurately race in this country sits? Where are we? There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of dissonance there, but where do you think things are in reality, I guess?
Well, I think we're in an interesting moment because, to me, as a quantitative guy, and obviously arguments on all sides, there's an incredible dichotomy between the reality of race relations in the contemporary United States and what many people, both blacks and whites, think. A recent piece I wrote for Commentary was actually called "No, There's No Coming Race War, Everybody." And it took kind of an empirical look at this, like what percentage of crime is interracial? It's a tiny percentage. Person most likely to kill you, as I recall, is your ex-wife. I mean, what percentage of that is specifically white on black? That's like 25% of the tiny percentage. I mean, so I think there's the reality, and then there's the image that's generated by media on left and right, by the way. The reality is overwhelmingly positive. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers here, Pew Research every couple of years looks at what they call the vote for, work for question, which to me, especially among males, is a good measure of realistic racism. Not, is someone going to be your best friend, but would you object to voting for a qualified political candidate of a different race in your party? Would you object to having as a boss someone who can treat you as a subordinate, someone of a different race? And the latest data on that, if you look at Pew Research, vote for qualified candidates, search something like that, the percentage of real racists using that as a metric was about 8%. It was 8% of whites wouldn't vote for a well-qualified African-American of their party. There were 6-7%, slightly less blacks that would be by that standard racist. And you see some specific categories. I mean, one thing we often forget in this white-black debate is that America is an extraordinarily diverse country.
Yeah.
I mean, I believe we're now over 2% plus both Muslim American, Jewish American. Those clearly aren't races, of course. But I mean, those groups actually experience more prejudice. I mean, post 9/11, the percentage of people that said they wouldn't vote for a well-qualified Muslim man was 38%. But I mean, even there was no level of racial bias that reached over 50%. Most, if you look at Catholic, Black, white, Latino, we're in the order of 8 to 12%. That's the number of bigots. You see that reflected by that measure. And you see that reflected in society in general. As I recall, last I looked, about 25% of marriages are interracial. And that would be, I'll pull that up while we're talking, but it's right around there. I mean, for Asian Americans in some years, the majority of marriages are interracial. And I will note, by the way, Hispanic is not a racial category. Certainly things like Irish, Italian are not racial categories. Marriages between a Latino guy and a Greek woman would probably be counted as same race marriages. So, I mean, there's an extraordinary amount of interesting wedding in all likelihood. A lot of fun. But I mean, that's an extraordinarily positive finding. To some extent, looking at me or looking at you, it would be difficult for many Americans to be classically racist. I mean, I'm Black, white, I mean, Native, to some extent, according to at least family record. I mean, the question is, who could I dislike genetically? I guess Asians, if I really wanted to make a project out of it and look around. But I mean, that's becoming more and more common in the USA. Many of my Latino friends use terms like la mezcla, like there aren't that many unmixed individuals in a number of states, Arizona, Texas. So I think the reality is pretty positive. But then you turn on the TV, right? I mean, like if you actually watch, and again, I'm probably about center right, but I think both sides are equally bad on this. I mean, if you turn on the mainstream MSNBC mass media, you'll certainly see George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. I mean, the image that's presented is of a race war. But if you go in the other direction to the right, I mean, there's an entire site called White Girl Bleed a Lot, whose creator I once bickered with on Twitter. That just seems to be like every black on white crime. Like if you look through it, it's like young woman, slapped by African-American man after boyfriend starts fight with black guy. It's just like, that's two guys that got in a fight. I don't even know who won. But this is presented as, they're coming, the minorities are charging. The reality, something I always say when I do long form speeches, is that the reality of interracial crime in particular is remarkably positive, although you hate to see anyone be the victim of a crime. If you Google BJS crime statistics, Bureau of Justice Statistics crime report for any year, most recent I looked at is 2018, I believe 2019 is now out. They break down serious crime across a number of factor variables, including race of the perp. And I mean, in 2018, there were close to 20 million serious crimes. These were either violent crimes or property crimes serious enough to be counted as what's called an index offense. And of those 20 million crimes, the total number that were white on black or black on white violent crimes was about 600,000. So my in the head math is not as good as it used to be. That's around 3%. I often round that up to 5% online. But if you're looking at crimes serious enough to get the FBI involved, of 20 million, 600,000 involved whites and blacks fighting. Now, of those, this is a little more politically incorrect, quote unquote, but 75+% happen to be black on white. There are more white people. They have more money. This isn't even very surprising, but that's certainly not what you'd guess from MSNBC, CNN, and so on. But I mean, again, the reality of interracial crime, I'm more about the fact that that's 3% of serious crime. I mean, I wrote a piece called There's No Race War Coming, and that's my perspective. I think that if interracial crime is 3% of serious crime, black, white, interracial, violent crime, being very specific, if, 20+% of marriages are interracial, I don't think that we're on the verge of falling into, Abaddon, but I think that we're certainly told this all the time. And this gets into another thing I look at. I don't know if I'd say I research. This hasn't been a conference paper. This was only 5 pages of taboo. But ever since Barry Glassner's Great Culture of Fear back in 1999, I've been very interested in what the correlation is between what we're afraid of, what the mass media tells us to be afraid of, and what is actually dangerous. And it is low. I'd estimate it over the past couple of years at like 0.1. So it's not just that we're scared with these stories of white on black and black on white because they make such great clickbait, male warriors of the other team are coming to steal your wife. it's not just that. It's all the other BS like plane crashes, animal attacks, your child's going to be kidnapped. None of this. I mean, the leading killer in the United States, and this is very critical to me as a guy who's a former athlete, is heart disease. There's a long tradition of that in my family. I can lose a few pounds myself. 700,000 people every year. That's twice COVID. So we ignore the things that are actually dangerous to focus on these fake ritualistic fears. And that's my impression when it comes to race relations. I think overall they're pretty good. I definitely think that those in charge of the media and tech have realized you can terrify people by invoking the enemy.
Yeah, and I've that's all very helpful because some of that I also was aware of, but it feels like there's this. I guess there's a few things connected here in my mind, and you tell me what you think about this. But so, we have 8 years of, Obama presidency, first, African American president, and then we get 4 years of Trump, and you get this incident, which, it's very interesting in some ways, and I think the pandemic and everyone being at home and people not being at work has to do something with this, but everybody is seeing, George Floyd, which is, horrible, murder, it's awful. The guy died. It was terrible. It was terrible. And I don't think anybody disputes that. Right. But, well, I mean, maybe some do, but most people are like, yeah, it was terrible. It was awful. But it created this, I guess, avalanche of, advocacy and people making these claims of, see, this is a problem. There's so much of this, and we're just seeing it now. We're just having recordings of it now. This is a problem, and we need to go and advocate in social justice and all of these things. And when you try to have whomever you are, right? If you're black, white, mixed race, Latino, say, well, wait a minute. This is what the data shows. This is what's actually happening. You're absolutely, going to be made a pariah, right? You can't have these conversations, right? Or discussing maybe some of the underlying issue, which I would say is, police brutality is probably a big problem for all folks, right? I think for black people, white people, Latinos. And that's not to demonize police, but that there is an issue with police brutality, and you could maybe make some gestures about need for better training and more holistic ways of thinking about how to engage with folks. But do you think the George Floyd thing was like a big moment or representative moment, and then it kind of cascaded outside of that in the summer? How do in your mind, based on what the data actually shows, some of what you just detailed, and for the, I don't want to say that it's all sensationalist, but how the media kind of addresses this, how do you think is a instructive or healthy way of having that conversation?
Well, I think that first of all, I think that each incident of this kind, racial conflict, police citizen conflict, is a standalone incident that's different from every other. So, I mean, I think the first piece of advice I would give people is when you see a case like this, black guy, white guy get in a fight, cop abuses a citizen, there's a tendency to pick sides. Right. I mean, they're literally flags that represent all of these camps now, whether it's the thin blue line or the, RBG, revolutionary quote unquote flag. It's tempting to kind of run to your team like it is in almost every other situation. I find as intelligent adults, especially for the probably majority of your listeners who are scholars or grad students or whatnot, that's not really the way to approach this. The way to approach this is to look at the facts of each situation, and you'll find that some fit your narrative and some don't. I mean, I think the George Floyd thing, now there is a counter narrative even around George Floyd, which is that George Floyd tested positive for what I'd call a near fatal dose of fentanyl. I mean, it is very likely those officers are going to be acquitted in court. So even there, the facts are not perfectly clear. The officer that was primarily responsible, Derek Chauvin, by all accounts, if you look at sort of the discussion boards for the city in question, or you look through the work histories of those two men, and this is all easily available online, those two guys probably knew each other. They'd worked security long term at what was a tough, primarily Hispanic American nightclub in that city. So are we talking about personal conflict? You know, a guy you'd gotten into a scuffle with once before is now very intoxicated. If you listen to the full tape there, I mean, there's a long, somewhat hostile discussion going on before this happens. So even there's a counter narrative. But that said, I don't take the counter narrative all that seriously in this one case. I think that if your suspect submission procedure is someone that can fight passively, is, well, let's put him in a classic, neck knee hold for 10 minutes and see what happens. You need to revise those departmental procedures. I mean, I think that was obviously an ugly case.
Absolutely.
So, but even there, the question is, okay, this was an ugly case. One, does anyone deny that? Two, is there any evidence of racism here in the traditional sense? And three, is this common? And I think the answer to number one is no. I consume a variety of media. And the thing I was not surprised by, almost pleased by would be the word. But the day after the Floyd killing was that virtually everybody, from Ben Shapiro to Tim Weiss, was saying this is an ugly incident. Like me, some of them mentioned, well, technically, they're going to argue that it was justified in court. But again, using a fighting hold for 10 minutes isn't a good way to restrain people. This is bad. Let's punish these officers. So I think there was universal consensus on this. Mm-hmm. The next question is, does this indicate racism? And when I say racism, I'm using what I think of as the real sense of the term, but the traditional sense, strong bias, generally genetic, against the members of a particular race. Was that in effect here, as opposed to anything from class bias to just fight or flight reaction? I think it's fairly hard to demonstrate that. The lead officer who is responsible, Chauvin, is in an interracial marriage. That doesn't mean he's not a bigot. It's a pretty strong indicator, however. One of the other guys, Thao, was Hmong, if I recall correctly. Mm-hmm. Another one, Kung, was Korean and Latino, again, if I recall correctly. So you've got two white guys and two men of color restraining this guy. I mean, it's very hard to argue that that's prejudice against any particular group. Mm-hmm. And then three, I think the big one is this something that happens a lot? And if you listen to Black Lives Matter, you get the strong impression that it is. Mm-hmm. Benjamin Crump, well-known attorney on kind of the left side of the fence, literally wrote a book called Open Season, The Legalized Genocide of Colored People. Okay, this is an Amazon best-selling book. Right. This is a respected member of the bar. These aren't fringe things. Right. Cherno Biko, who was one of BLM's top 10 at the time, went on Fox News and said every day, and essentially an innocent Black man is murdered. Use the term murdered. I mean, so we're looking at an estimate of between 360 and on the genocidal side, perhaps 10,000 of these, being very conservative here, of these innocent brothers just killed. That's getting to the point. If you actually go to a database like the Washington Post, The Counted, the total number of unarmed Black individuals killed by police in a typical year, like last year, is between 10 and 15. Right. Last year was originally listed as 9. They later counted a number of previously unknown, race unknown victims, interracial victims. And they got that up to 14, as I recall. But I mean, that's what we're talking about. There are about 60 million police citizen encounters every year. So to some extent, what I'd recommend in terms of police violence is not using each one of these rare, vanishingly rare cases as a rally flag for some sort of national change, but instead just arresting and punishing the officers responsible for each one, which would literally be 26 guys.
Mm-hmm. And doesn't it distract from, I don't want to say actual, but when it distracts from hate crimes that are happening and that are happening for, or violent crimes that are happening for other groups? I think you'll know this more than I will. I think still, as of last year or 2 years ago, Jewish people are still the number one group that are the recipient of hate crimes in the United States. Is that correct?
Yeah, per capita. And we have to be fairly honest about this. I mean, one reason that's not, again, so there's a lot of universally known but sort of politically incorrect information here, where if you're having a beer off the record with anyone in criminal justice or quantitative political science, I mean, they'll point some of this out. There are only about 7,000 hate crimes, actual prosecuted hate crimes. The FBI has that report in their files, and you can access it in a typical year. Again, there are 20 million crimes in a typical year. Black people are overrepresented among victims of hate crime. We're also overrepresented among perpetrators of hate crime, by the way. I mean, the perps in 21+% of hate crime cases are African American. But I mean, many groups are more overrepresented among hate crime victims, Jewish Americans, Muslim Americans, so on down the line. White Americans, in fact, that number is kind of inching up. White Americans were the victims of roughly 1,000 hate crimes in the most recent year I've looked at. So it's a diverse palette. Anyone can be a bigot or a jackass. The thing with the Jewish question, and again, I don't like to present things as known unless we have specific data on that. I would guess that one reason there's so little mass media discussion of this wave of attacks on Jews is that it's so multicolored. I mean, if you look at New York City, for example, you had that crazy case where a woman was arrested for attacking a couple of people who I believe were Jewish, beating them pretty badly, is released without bail and immediately attacks a Jew. And I think that had that been a white supremacist in a southern state who beat up two black people for no reason, gets out of jail, no bail, apparently knows the judge to at least some extent, gets out, beats up a black guy. I mean, I think that you're talking about, news vans outside the courthouse and Al Sharpton marching around, your new fitter version Al Sharpton, and so on. And in reality, that is a very large percentage of the crime against Jewish Americans. That's why that's not discussed. This, by the way, again, my focus with interracial crime is, look, that's 3% of serious crime, move on to new issues. But if we're going to discuss it, it's absolutely relevant that interracial crime is not majority white on black and hasn't been for decades. It's not majority white on POC. In the most recent year on record, now the average would be probably 75 to 80% black on white. The most recent year on record, you had more than 500,000 black on white attacks, and you only had about 60,000 white on black attacks. So interracial crime in 2018 was actually 90% black on white. So what we're seeing here that again, not typical, tough year, but what we're seeing here is the total creation of narratives where there's almost no interracial crime, but there's very little. But media outlets know that, images of these different groups brawling will attract clicks. That's point one. So you're focusing on almost unethically on something that's not a major issue. And then you're being wildly dishonest with it, where you're presenting things like the George Zimmerman case as typical of interracial crime. Like, no, interracial crime is 90% the other way if you're going to waste my time talking about it. So you wind up with this weird situation where a lot of my black buddies are legitimately afraid. They have issues going to tough white neighborhoods. They are fearful and they see the police behind them. But that's because of this invented, unreal narrative. Like in reality, the cops may be, whatever Fryer found, 16% more rude to you if you're a black guy. And that's the actual difference was in 3% of stops versus 2% of stops or some such. There was hostility. But I mean, you're not going to be shot by a police officer. Your odds are literally 15 in 40 million. We're creating fear among people with this bullshit narrative, and that's not rare. This goes on across the board. White fear of minority crime, sure, but also a lot of this stuff. I mean, the idea that racism is everywhere, that police are going to be called on you as you walk your dog, all of this is based on a small number of widely reported incidents to a shocking extent.
But the fact does remain, though, is that there are problems for the black community. There are problems for black folk, but what you're saying is it's not necessarily coming from white folks or from other races. I mean, it does, but it's not as, how it's portrayed in media or at large. And so where are those problems coming from? Like, where do we see those issues, whether it's crime or anything else?
Well, I think that's a very complex question. I mean, so I think this gets into the idea of systemic racism. I find this term, when it's used in practice by any but the best sociologists, certainly when it's used online, to be almost meaningless. It very often just means a system that disadvantages blacks or Latinos. For example, the SAT produces more Asian high performers than, BIPOC or whatever high performers. So there must be some racism there. I mean, the toughest part of the SAT is just a math test. I find this utterly implausible. I think if you want to unpack systemic racism, the phrase is really used to mean 3 or 4 things. The first one is genocidal contemporary racism today, to which my reaction is, bro, that doesn't exist. I mean, again, we just looked at, and this isn't me exaggerating from the center or the right. I mean, we just look, there's a best-selling book called Legalized Genocide of Colored People. This is a common thesis. Some of the things involved here might be police genocide of African Americans, extensive white on black interracial crime, is something that's alleged. Income differences are alleged to be due to contemporary prejudice. This is said pretty often. I think there is, when you take that 8 to 10% of bigots that I just mentioned, that's a pretty well documented statistical figure, and you look at the impact that it has on black life, and then you adjust for the positive impact of affirmative action, I don't think the argument that there is contemporary genocidal bias against black people stands up at all. When I mention this to friends from Jamaica or Nigeria, they think it's a joke. Both of those groups, by the way, often out-earn whites. I mean, that I don't think is real. Yes. Now, there are two real meanings of systemic racism, or two real explanations for where problems in the black community come from. One is that past racism correlates with problems in the community. And this, I think, conservatives sometimes ignore, but I don't really think you can dispute that that's the case. Like when you say the average white family has about $100,000 in wealth and the average black family has about $7,000 in wealth, that means one specific thing. The average white family owns one cheap house, and we don't yet. That's literally what it means. Real estate is an incredible chunk of that asset value. Differences in ownership of securities or even valuable things, jewelry, throwback jerseys without kidding around, weapons, animals, those are quite similar across races. So the difference in white, black wealth, a lot of that dates back to stuff like the Homestead Act, where there used to be a phrase in the law, white man with a gun. If you were a free white man with a gun, you could literally go out to Nebraska, and if you could fight off the Kiowa, you could settle in and build yourself a farm and, live in a turf house for 2 years until you built a wood one. I mean, you had that right. Technically, sometimes you did if you were black or native, but let's just say it would be kind of dangerous for you to trek out there and live surrounded by 1,000 buckskin-clad white warriors and try to build your turf house. So that the impact of past prejudice on largely black financial success is there. Substantially smaller than what many people think, given 50 years of affirmative action, but it's there. Another element of systemic racism that I don't really view as racism at all, that has a very significant effect on black outcomes, is the set of cultural issues that developed during the period of intense ethnic conflict. You can attribute these to racism, or as Tom Sowell does in Black Rednecks and White Liberals, you can simply attribute these to large, again, sort of warrior class groups living in close proximity to one another before public schooling. I mean, there are lots of ways these traits could have developed. But I mean, for example, the black crime rate, violent crime rate, is about 2.4 times the white rate. I only focus on violent crime so I can avoid these arguments about misdemeanor weed charges and so on. That's not why people go to prison. But I mean, black VCR, 2.5 times the white rate. The black out of wedlock birth rate, what used to be called the illegitimacy rate, 72%. Whites and Hispanics aren't doing that well either, by the way. Those rates are about 40% and 60%. So I mean, this is something no one should feel superior on, but even worse for us if we're considering it a race.
Right.
There's some academic disengagement. I mean, the black SAT has been rising. I often debate IQ hereditarian types online. There's very little evidence for that, in my opinion. But I mean, it's risen to 950. The white score hasn't just stayed stable. It's risen from 1050 to 1110. So, I mean, we trail by 160 points on a 1,600-point test. These are obviously issues in the community. It's just silly to deny them. It's silly to assume that a guy who has a 960 on the standardized boards is going to get into the same college or get the same job as a guy who has a 1,200 on the standardized boards. Like, we're both done fairly well in the academic world. I mean, that's just not something you can deny. You have to get in early, teach kids STEM, all that. It's tough to do. But those issues in the black community, I do think, are due largely to past ethnic conflict. I don't totally agree with Sowell. But the question is, so what? I mean, if 100 years ago, we were the most oppressed of various brutalized groups in an agrarian society, now the law has changed. There are programs designed to help us, but because of things like test scores, we're having trouble taking advantage of them. I don't really see that describing that as racism is particularly useful. Those are the three components of this broad idea. And I think the idea that there's extensive contemporary racism in the middle class is flawed. It's so far off that you get into SJW fantasy when you start trying to make this argument. Like, 4 years ago, I heard my classmates say nigga rapping along to a song. And let me tell you, I was traumatized. I didn't get into Harvard. I just got into the Claremont colleges. Like, shut up, kid. Like, that is not, without disrespecting any guy's one lived experience, that's not the problem our ancestors faced in that Black community or that Latino or that Native community or that Irish community. But the other two things do exist. Those are real problems.
So I guess the one thing about it is that how do you're not saying, well, let me clarify what you are and what you aren't saying, I guess. So you're saying that currently you don't believe that systemic racism doesn't exist, or that it's just not a helpful way of conceptualizing problems within the world?
Well, I don't think that there is, when you say systemic racism, I would agree that two of the 3 points that are sometimes argued. So, I mean, I'll talk trash on Twitter, but breaking this out as an academic in some depth, I think two of the 3 components of the argument have some value. Of course, past racism cost Blacks and Hispanics, and for that matter, urban Irishmen. If you ever go to Southie, I don't know if racism is the word, Appalachia, but that race, class matrix, whatever, obviously is responsible for some issues in those communities I just named 4. Black community, perhaps most of all, sure. I also think that in all those communities I just mentioned, no one would deny that cultural issues like fatherlessness exist. No serious person could deny that. Some politically correct guys never lived in the hood might, but if you go down there and you ask the priest or the preacher, they'll tell you what's up. So those two things are valid. The argument that today there are systems that once you make that affirmative action adjustment, treat Blacks, whites, and Latinos dramatically differently, I don't see a ton of evidence for that. Mm-hmm. What I see when I look at sociology, by the way, because there is a wide body of literature, and I think a lot of the economists on the right, Tom Sowell, Walter Williamson, are just like, that's crap. I don't pay attention to that. Mm-hmm. Social science, bathroom reading. That's actually, as a social scientist, as a Paul's guy, that's not really how I feel about the stuff that's come out in the last 20 years. Right. What I do feel about it, though, is that it's pretty situational, and they only look at one half of the situations. Mm. So, like in my book, I look at Deva Pager's great study, where she looks at whether Black people are more likely to be rejected for jobs than equally qualified white people. Mm-hmm. Now, one thing I will note in this study is that virtually everybody got a job. I mean, so there are a lot of ways of conceptualizing the dependent variable here. I mean, she had a pool of hundreds of students pretend to be former convicts and so on across a couple of different categories. As I recall, acceptance rate for the Black kids was like 17%. For the white kids was around 30%. They each sent out 40 plus resumes. So in reality, all of these ambitious young people would have been hired. That's just one note that's never made. But also when you look at what went on with the study, which again is a good top flight study, she confined her search, if I recall this correctly, to public sector, white-owned, non-affirmative action employers in Wisconsin in the late 1990s. And like, there's nothing wrong with that. I would assume that public sector, white-owned employers in Wisconsin in the early 1990s might have been slightly biased. But the immediate flip is, what about public sector employers? Mm-hmm. Like, what if you applied to those great, bus and train networks in Milwaukee? Because I see a lot of well-off middle-class brothers working there. Mm-hmm. I mean, what if you applied to government jobs beyond that? What if you applied in academia? Do you think you'd be disadvantaged by being a Black graduate of an elite undergrad school like these applicants? And I think the answers are pretty obvious. What if you applied to, we often downplay our own potential in the ethnic communities. What if you applied to that 20% of businesses that have a tough Black or Hispanic or Asian boss? I mean, do you think Johnson Publications is not going to hire you? Rockefeller, when it existed? Mm-hmm. P.F. Chang's, as I understand, is an Asian-owned business. I don't mean to pick a stereotypical one there. 1,000. So I think that there's a very easy response to a lot of this. And when you add up the pros and the cons, and you look at a very broad dependent variable like income, and by the way, people are free to look at that Pager study. I might have missed one category or added one. But I mean, the basics, late 90s, Wisconsin, almost entirely white-owned, private sector, those are undisputed. So how you target this stuff is very, very important. And I think that when people like Walter Williams, for example, look at broader dependent variables like income, not specific what happens in this school in Tennessee, but what are the incomes for different groups? We've found that since the late 1960s, Black guys, white guys, and Asian individuals, for some reason, some of these studies do find residual bias against Hispanics, which is bizarre. But Blacks, whites, and Asians, with perhaps you find it less so, but with the same qualifications, have pretty much the same life outcome. Thomas Sowell did a crude but good version of this in 1967, where he looked at books in the home, library cards, and father present. Black guys and white guys, he found, had pretty much the same income, at least in the North, since the real civil rights changes of 54 and then 64. Like, you were as likely to get hired then, you're as likely to get hired now if you do the affirmative action adjustment. The real issue, and the thing that I would disagree with some quote unquote Black conservatives on, is that there are more Black and Hispanic people that were forced into that working class by past prejudice. So this is true for Appalachian whites as well, but that almost doesn't matter. So it is a bit unfair to say, well, the issue right now is class. Well, sure, but I'm lower class because, my ancestors lost a war 100 years ago. But the way to compensate for that has to be to help the poor. It can't just be to take only the minority 40% of the poor and give them unearned money or jobs. So I think that's a very clear point there.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where you have, I had Bo Weingart on, here a while ago now, and he, we talked about this, and he was like, systemic racism. He's like, you can conceptualize things that way. He's like, but if you really tease it out, you can't see how can a system be racist, right? He's like, you can have individuals within a system, right? And over a large period of time, you have a bunch of, some bad individuals that, definitely can push the system in certain ways. But at the end of the day, he leans it on the individual on both positive and negative, I believe, and which is, yeah, if you have better individuals and systems that are for all different types of folks, then you're going to be able to have, better opportunities and outcomes, hopefully for all people. But the system itself, there's something really slippery about that, right? Because then you're starting to say, well, the system of jurisprudence or system of different political structures, and then you start looking at all the way to the local levels. If everything is just as a system racist, then the only option for that, right, if you're not reforming it, is to overthrow the system, right? And that just doesn't work very well, because it's obviously not true, because the system, right, quote unquote, has done well enough in the general sphere of things, right, in terms of economics and history. And so it's like, okay, well, how do you then? To me, it's a conceptual thing, right? It's like, yeah, and I agree with you. I think there definitely has been historically, maybe up to the middle of the 20th century, some type of historical, systemic, oppression and or racism. But I think that more the past probably 60 or 70 years, you definitely have people that, again, if you look at the trend lines, we keep progressing more and more and more. It's like that old statement, Obama and I think other people have said, he's like, would you want to be Black in 2021 or, in 1951, right? It's not even a question, right? And so, okay, but that aside, and I agree with what you're saying, but this is you are almost made into, again, you're put on the leper colony and maybe going to be, hanged at the, at the gallows or whatever. If you say that, if I go out and say, I don't believe in systemic racism, I'm going to get flogged, publicly or whatever. And you may as well. And so how do we have, or how do you think we have those conversations where it's like, look, let's look at some of the nuance. Let's look at some of the data points. Maybe we need to redefine some of these things, or we need to correct for some of these things. How do we kind of, manufacture those kinds of conversations, you think? Or what experiences have you had in trying to do that?
Well, I think one piece of advice I would give people is turn off Twitter. The same thing for Facebook at the group level, Insta, where every ex-girlfriend posts 3 pictures a minute and along with her, lefty political opinions. In reality, people don't think like this. I mean, I'm not one of those guys who's really into like locker room talk in the sense that I dramatically change my behavior when I'm around a group of other people and there are no cameras on. But I can tell you, if I'm on the basketball court or the golf course or something like that, the level of sensitivity is literally probably 1% of what it is on social media where people can see you. And people have these conversations all the time. They might then censor how they discuss them on a public media forum. But I can tell you, as a faculty member and executive, I'm one of our ombudsmen for a solid historically Black college. We talk about this stuff all the time as a group of Black men in a locker room. I mean, it's I don't think that this is forbidden. I think What you have is a weird kind of emperor has no clothes double standard, actually.
Yeah.
Where you find that either offline and outside of the journals, um, or in a totally anonymous setting, like survey research, people will say what they think. When they're in a very specific setting, like online and or writing a piece for publication and or there's a camera nearby, there's a very different false presentation. And the other day I mentioned this in passing. I said, and I was very open, I haven't done an IRB serious version of this yet, but I was looking through some of my paperwork and I said, in probably 50 different settings, like classroom surveys, Twitter polls, testing out my, Survey Monkey Pro, like all this stuff. I've asked people these sort of woke questions just to see whether they agreed with them, just almost as a survey test. And what I found is that I had like 2,000 pages of data, and the percentage of people that agreed with them was always 2 to 4%. So an example of these questions might be, can males become in any practical way, like competing in sports, women that should be treated as females? Do you feel your upper middle class Black and Hispanic buddies are oppressed? Do you feel that the reason for gaps on standardized tests like the math SAT is cultural bias as versus something like studying? And in every case, if I asked one of these to test the program or whatever, only about 2% of people agreed with the woke conclusion. And I tested this out on Twitter. I just asked the questions again. I mean, I asked the bias one and the trans one. And I have a right-leaning but very diverse account, you're on it, of 25,000 people. Right. Both these questions got hundreds of responses. And again, it was just like straight down the board, 3%, yes, I believe that, 97% no. And people were messaging me like, are you trying to get canceled? Are you an idiot? You're not full yet in terms of tenure. We can't say these things. But again, the 97% and the 3% were as they were. What Galileo said, still moves. So I think that is to a large extent what we're dealing with here. I don't think most people believe this stuff. If you asked, is a Hispanic businessman oppressed today? I think that Latino friends and acquaintances of mine could say, well, there was that one time I was turned down for a date, or I know what happened at the Goldman interview, not to single that firm out. I don't know if they're racist, but something like that. But it wouldn't be like a massive constant prejudice in any form. And I think the flip side of this is if you asked a blue collar Italian guy or a slightly overweight woman or virtually anyone else, white, Black, whatever, they would have had similar experiences. So I don't think most people believe this, kind of getting to the point. I think it's culturally conventional to say that. How do you get around the cultural convention? I mean, talk to actual friends offline. Believe it or not, my Twitter and Facebook are wildly censored. I mean, I actually don't use profanity. I generally won't use any kind of slur even to illustrate it. I did recently with like the N-word debate. But that's entirely because I don't want bad faith people to retweet me like, this is what Reilly really thinks. This clearly wasn't a joke about women. It's his actual opinion. So avoid that as much as possible.
No, that's great. Let me ask you one. There's two other points I want to ask you about, but how much do you have any ideas, whether it's academically or maybe just personally, about this? Because it's connected with, I know you're mostly in the crime or looking at crime types of numbers and stuff, but this idea of equality versus equity versus opportunity. What do you educate us? Tell us, because I think that there is, as much as you want about, I have these debates and these conversations with people and trying to parse out the differences and then, what that looks like and what we should be shooting for. And how do you see this stuff?
I actually think, and by the way, in terms of research, I'm actually pretty polyglot. I like my school because we are a comprehensive or a research too. It's a good university. I mean, we're in the top couple hundred nationally, but it's not so much like you need to write specifically about the mating habits of this insect because we are the world's leading department in, sexual etymology or anything like that. Right. So, I mean, one of my books looks at taboos in language. One of them actually is an original research book. And, Regnery put a flashy title on it. I went with the popular press, but it looks at the large number of high profile recent racial incidents, many of them actually billed as hate crimes, that turned out to be complete fakes.
Yeah.
And I've written about a range of things. I mean, my latest sort of mainstream conference paper for Midwest politics looked at the effect of race, ethnicity, and a couple of other variables on three measures of conflict: murder rate, terrorism within a country, and international war. And what I found, actually, and it's been cited several times, I mean, at least from what I've heard, the name Riley. I actually don't obsessively track everyone that's ever mentioned me, but like
Right.
what I found was pretty interesting. I found that racial diversity didn't seem to be a predictor of increased conflict within states at all. If you look at Singapore, Costa Rica, New Zealand, the most diverse states, USA is right up there, Canada, assimilated, if you want to use that term, racial populations get along all the time. That's been true since Rome. What I found was that ethnic diversity, where people still identified primarily with their original tribe, spoke primarily a different language, still had an affection for a previous flag, perhaps, that massively predicted terrorism and civil war. Racial diversity didn't. So, I mean, that would be an example of kind of the more serious side, I guess. Although I think hoax was pretty solid research. I've written about COVID this year, so I do have that luxury of talking about a range of different things. And hopefully do so as a Renaissance man rather than annoying dilettante, which is always the risk.
I think so. Yeah, I think I do. The Renaissance man does fit. It's a nice hat for you.
Cool. An ex-girlfriend of mine once described me as a Renaissance asshole, which I thought was a funny description. She was talking about like the stuff I did, like you're playing basketball, you're writing papers, you're cooking, you're doing everything but handling these problems. You're a Renaissance jackass. And I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. It has Renaissance in it. But I mean, in all seriousness, though, I think that the distinction between equality and equity is, especially in the frame of opportunity, is a really clear distinction. And I think actually because of some of the antics of the edge right online, a lot of the things that, for example, James Lindsay says are less likely to be taken seriously as he talks about this. But his original definition of this, when he and Pluckrose were being interviewed about the grievance studies affair, is pretty on point. I mean, I was actually going to cite it as somebody else's because of recent antics, but I think it's roughly accurate. Sure. Equality is simply the condition of having the same starting point or the same chance to compete. It's worth noting that it's fairly hard to get to equality. I don't think we fully have. We're perhaps 90% there. But equality is an equal starting point, an equal chance to compete. Equity is actually a term from the financial sector, and I'm putting a little of my input in here. But equity is receipt of a proportionate share of resources. That's what it means in business, literally. I have equity in this firm.
Right.
So, I mean, the two are very different. Equality is the chance to go out there and compete with everybody else, which we mostly have. I definitely think you need to do a class adjustment here, but if you take a middle-class Nigerian guy who goes to East Aurora High School and is planning on matriculating into the University of Illinois, and you take a middle-class Irish-American white guy with the same background, and you follow them for 10 years, those two groups have almost identical board scores. Those two guys are going to have very similar life outcomes. That's equality. Equity is assuming that absent some kind of evil, be that, some sort of residual genetic failing or some kind of hidden but real racism in the system, the ghost in the machine, absent that, everyone would receive equal finishing shares.
Yeah. And
I don't think that's true. Now, again, this gets into the broader dependent variables used in books as versus the narrower ones used in sociology or POLS papers. So if you look at something like income in total in the same state, I mean, you could argue you should see reasonably close finishes there. But when you look at specific sectors, whether you're looking at professional athletics, which is very heavily Black, computer science, which is very heavily Asian American, even something like individual pre-household income, there's no reason you would expect to see everyone finish at the same spot. I mean, one of the things I said in Taboo that, again, is something I'll drop into most full-length lectures is there's a gap. This has been very consistent since the late 1990s of about 17% between white and Black earnings. And this is almost universally on the political left attributed to racism. But that doesn't really seem to be the case. If you make a couple of simple adjustments, and this isn't original to me, June O'Neill did this back in 1994, but you find that the gap almost totally closes. And I think you've heard me say this before in a lecture, so I won't give the whole speech. But I mean, basically, Black people are a lot younger than white people. The most common age would be absolutely legitimate to call this the modal average. For a Black guy's 27, white guy's 58. I mean, so just adjusting for that in 31 years, you're going to earn a substantial amount of money really has an effect on income and wealth differences. In some states, it eliminates more than a third of them. What states is also relevant. I mean, so African Americans are much more likely to live in the South because as a Black guy, that's where the boats landed, than in the North. And wages for everyone are much lower in the South. If you live in a trailer court in Texas, whether you're black, white, or Hispanic, you're not going to have the same sort of income as someone who lives in Midtown Manhattan. For regional and racial and class reasons, it's touchy to discuss this, but it's an obvious fact. Another variable that O'Neill and others have looked at, Seoul in 2005, is, again, board scores. What are your test scores? And if you adjust for just those three variables, the gap closes from 17% to 2 to 3%. So, I mean, the idea that peoples that have dramatically different median ages, regions of residence, levels of group pride, traditional jobs within the group, I would assume most French chefs, that's a high-paying profession, are indeed Frenchmen. I mean, so on down the line, the idea that these groups would all finish in the same position absent either racism or genetic inferiority is, in my opinion, absurd. I mean, that's the language Amy Chua uses to describe it. I think she's right. Tom Sowell uses to describe it. There's no reason to think that that's correct. So equity is the idea that we should give everyone a proportionate share of each field. And it's interesting. I noticed that people on kind of the nerd left, my fellow academics, will just sort of dismiss obvious examples like pro athletics and trading floors that are pretty integrated. But I mean, if you actually applied an equity principle to the NFL, I mean, every team would be 52% female. There can be no biological reason that these women seem to be a bit smaller. I mean, it's just training and conditioning and get them in the weight room. I mean, of the males, you'd have 13% African Americans, 60% whites, 18% Hispanics, 7-8% Asians. And a team that looked like that would have beautiful, wonderful marketing and promotional materials, and it would never win a game.
Right.
Like this isn't what we see.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the conceptual piece of it, right? Is I see it the exact same way. Is equality is everybody starting at the same starting line, right? Are we all starting at the same place? And equity is usually, are we all getting the same outcomes, right? Are we all getting the same end result, right? And to me, even if you take a Darwinian perspective, right, the variable differences within group and then between groups, that's absurd. And we're all obviously different. And that's I'm not making that a positive valence. I'm just saying that it's a fact that we all have our differences. Why would I want to have the same outcome as every single person? So if I work harder and if I do something, if we're all starting from the same starting line, let's say, why do we all have to finish at the same endpoint? That doesn't make any sense to me. You would want difference. Because that's how you get different entrepreneurship. That's how you get different innovative ideas. That's how you get different perspectives. That's how you get, all of those things. Obviously, you don't want people, I don't think, to be, hindered from doing something because of, you name it, race, gender, age, demographics, all those things. But to be at the same, to shoot for equity or to have equity of outcomes seems, it just, to me, within the logic of itself, it seems to fall on its face. I don't really get that. But you hear, if you look at the, Democratic National Platform and, most of the liberals and left, it's like, we have to be shooting for equity. And if we don't, then we're all racist bigots. Whomever you are, white, black, Latino, like you have to all want that. And if you don't, then there's something wrong with you or you're the racist. And I just don't understand how we have, again, a corrective conversation about that. It's like, why do we want equity? I don't understand.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that intelligent people, like I don't think anyone would describe you or I as a fanatic, or for that matter, Rod or Bo as fanatics. I mean, but the positions of the four of us would probably be all across literally the entire spectrum. I mean,
yes.
Bo Weingarten, excuse me. And I consider this to be a perspective in the sciences. I don't think it's evil or Hitlerian, but is an IQ hereditarian, as I understand. I mean, like his idea would basically be, to some extent, that you can't ever have you can't get equity, and it's questionable whether you can get equality because of large genetic differences between groups. And I mean, I don't think that's true. We can get into why if you want. But I mean, those perspectives are all across the board. And I think that being able to discuss them all honestly, I mean, Rod, on the other hand, is a proponent of virtually full equity, as I understand some of his tweets about income and so on. Right. I like both those guys quite a bit. I think they're both wrong. pretty seriously wrong. But I mean, just talking in groups like this, I think, is a great way to get past some of these barriers. But in terms of your definition was actually simpler and more concise than mine. I mean, yeah, equality is the same starting line, equity is the same finishing line. And as someone who always enjoyed track, I was a competitive runner for quite a few years. I still go out for runs all the time. I mean, that's just absurd. If I run a 5K, I'll probably still be in the top half of people. You know, the people that are still on high school or collegiate athletic teams will be the first 5%. Seniors, people that are just there to perhaps lose some weight, they'll bring up the back end. I mean, the idea that if you start a race, everyone's going to finish at the same time is absurd. That literally defeats the purpose of racing.
Of having a race, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's the same thing in day-to-day life. I mean, when you look at large racial and ethnic groups, you see that they differ in terms of median age. They differ in terms of region of residence. They do differ in terms of experiencing current racism. I wouldn't say the impact of that is zero, although I think it's very high. Mm-hmm. They differ in terms of past racism, which has much more of an effect. They differ in terms of isolation. They differ in terms of religion. Traditional Muslims and Christians have a pretty spotty record on educating women. When you look around the world and you see these IQ scores that seem bizarre, like Saudi Arabia 80, I mean, one obvious reason for that is that you have to give the test to students of both sexes. Are you, in fact, training students of both sexes? That's something that a feminist friend mentioned in passing once at a conference that I've never seen tested. That's extraordinarily interesting. Same for Africa, same for Eastern Europe, most low-scoring regions. So all of these things, from what you could call a feminist variable to plain age, differ between groups. There's no logical reason to expect them to finish at the same mark. And as I've said, even getting them to start at the same position is a little difficult. I mean, do you have the same starting point in a West Virginia trailer park as you do in a New York skyscraper? Maybe not. But at least we can get that to 5 or 10 or 15%. We can't just keep reholding the race until everyone's so exhausted they finish at the same point. And because of that, what equity in practice translates to, by the way, usually is just communism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But might say I'm exaggerating a bit, socialism. No. Yeah. But it very much is what we're going to do is let people finish and then suddenly spring on them the fact that they owe 61% of what they've brought home to others. Mm-hmm. And I have some pretty strong ethical problems with that, like 10, 20% redistributive taxes, that's civilization. But the basic idea that every time you are successful, you have to give all of the fruits of that success, financial and now even other, to other members in society that didn't do as well. I mean, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It also leads to a weird sort of bean counting, where a lot of people have used, the conservative commentator Ben Shapiro has used the term intersectional hierarchy of oppression, which, because he's used it, will probably never appear in an academic paper other than maybe mine, but actually is a fascinating way of looking at the whole thing. We start, when it comes to who can speak or who deserves money, in a purely equity scenario, sort of ranking people. In terms of what you can say, you get perhaps so many points for being Black or Latino, but also so many for being gay, so many for being poor, although that's often forgotten, so many for being trans, so many for being from overseas, so on down the line. And people will literally, in things like on-campus debates, look at one another and calculate whether they have more right to talk than this other person, or whether they would be more likely to gain in a quote-unquote equitable society than this other person. I think that's pretty crazy. In practice, there are so many variables. Have you been to prison? Did your father just die? That determine where you are in life as an individual, that ranking people on the basis of a randomly selected 3 or 4 of them is just absurd.
Well, and I think the funny irony about that is, as soon as you start to figure out however many, intersectionality points you have, what you get down to is the individual.
That's exactly right.
At the end of the day is, okay, I'm, gay or trans, and I'm a refugee, and I converted to Islam, and I live in, West Baltimore, whatever, right? And you do all these things of, this kind of, this woke Olympics, right? Like, who is the most whatever. And then it does become that thing of, well, you could be, just Black or just gay, but I'm Black, trans, and a Muslim, and it becomes that whole thing. And again, I'm saying this for some of these kind of extreme kind of groups on the left. But then it's like, okay, well, when you get down to all of these intersections, what you have is this unique person with all of these different layers. That's all it really is. And it's like, so why are we doing all that? Let's just cut all that fucking bullshit, and we just start with the individual where they're at. But and I guess that's the interesting thing is that I don't think we should have your point about equality. I agree with is I think aspirationally we should go for equality and moving it further and further, moving the needle up. I don't think we should have equity as a goal. It's going to happen where it's going to happen. And I also think if you're trying to impose equity on something, you're not letting the equality or the opportunities to kind of run its course, right? It's like, okay, we're going to give you all this stuff, and then we're going to, it's like restarting the race, and so you all have to make sure you finish here. And that doesn't make any sense to me as well. But if that is, again, for some folks, you are a racist bigot if you go against that, and kind of like your point for you and me and a few other people. I don't think anybody is like that, right? We just have different ways of seeing and conceptualizing this. I guess one other point here is, so all of the things you've been saying have been great, but this might be like a little bit of an academic kind of, tussle, but you're doing all the quantitative stuff. Oh, okay, well, you're telling me all your numbers, man. Like, okay, but it's not just stats. These are real people. They have lived experiences. They have real experiences. What about the qualitative stuff? What about the ethnographs? And what about the observations and the interviews? Like, you can't explain human beings with just numbers. How do you respond to that?
Well, sure you can. I mean, to some extent, quantitative studies are just the compilation of millions, if they're done well and they're large, of qualitative data points. So, I mean, if you do a well-done anonymous survey, and I mean, when I'm working with Black people, I'm the same race interviewer. I mean, and you ask people, how much racism do you experience? And you find that in day-to-day life, it's quite low. And the experience of bias is virtually identical for Blacks and Hispanics and poor whites, for example. You've found that. I mean, so qualitative research can unpack that in some more detail. I mean, you can find out why Black as versus Appalachian individuals feel oppressed. But the basic Tom Sowell, Orlando Patterson kind of data I've been presenting, like what's the income for these groups if you adjust for state, that doesn't change. If we find that Black people feel far more oppressed than whites at the same income level, which we don't, by the way, but if we find that, I mean, it's worth sitting people down and unpacking why that is. And the answer could be anything from residual racism to they're constantly taught to feel oppressed, by the way. But I mean, that doesn't change the basic fact that if you do certain things in life, you're unlikely to be poor, for example. Or that if you move from region A to region B, you're likely to make more money. I mean, that has almost no effect on the quantitative conclusions. So, yeah, I think we should look at as much qualitative data as possible. I think we should ask people how they feel about their lives and why they think as they do. But I guess my issue with lived experience is that lived experience is a way of summarizing the quantitative data in better, deeper detail. It's not a counter to the quantitative data. So if I ask a bunch of Black people, hey, bro, do you feel like you're in danger of being killed by the police? And they say, absolutely. And they all say they've seen a case of police murder, and they all cite George Floyd. That, while it's horrible, while it indicates this may be prevalent, and again, you could test this in a deeper quantitative study, but while it indicates this may be prevalent among African-American males, that doesn't change the fact that the total number of unarmed Black men killed by police in 2019 was 14, or unarmed Black people. So I think that's my point. Like, people can feel all sorts of ways. They are not necessarily correct. And it's worth noting, by the way, that we only hear this argument when a popular left-wing position is not defensible using quantitative techniques.
Yes.
We never hear it in other directions. So, for example, I considered writing a book. I've actually written most of it. I'm going to drop it online as a PDF. But I wrote, just young men need to read it. This isn't one I'm going to argue with publishers for months about, but I wrote a book called Alt Wrongs, looking at the issues with the alt-right. And one of the things I found is that the majority of alt-righters feel things that you could describe as lived experiences. Many of them grew up in working class Black or Latino neighborhoods, and they feel that whites are more likely to be abused for racial reasons than Blacks. Looking at the hate crime data, I wouldn't say that's true. I would say that's one guy's experience because he lost some fights in the hood. I mean, but that is a lived experience.
Right.
Many of these people feel that both whites and blacks have a passionate genetic attachment to their race, deeper in their attachment to the American flag. That's profoundly untrue. But I understand why you'd feel it as a guy who was perhaps a member of a white gang in a mostly black neighborhood. So those are all lived experiences, but no one ever says, well, most black Americans aren't patriots because, Scorpion X from 8 Coon said so. That's as much of a lived experience as anybody else's. But again, I think the short answer is that compared to a stated data set with 1 million observations in it, each one thoughtfully condensed from a person's impressions across 10 or 12 different metrics, compared to that, someone saying, I feel there's a lot of racism doesn't, to me, have the same impact. Are they right?
Yeah, and this is I've explained this before, where the major problem with qualitative research is helpful and we need to use it, but is it doesn't have ecological validity a handful of times, right? You can't scale it. There's no, 10 people's experience doesn't mean that it's the other 110 people's experience in a data set. And so it doesn't necessarily always have generalizability. That doesn't invalidate that the qualitative research. It just means that you can't make broad sweeping statements just from a handful of lived experience. Again, that doesn't invalidate the experience of a few people, but you also want to make sure is it commiserate with the actual quantitative data as well. So okay, so I can't let you go unless you tell me a little bit about politics more generally, or more specifically, whichever way you look at it. We have in 20 days, right? A new president, new administration with the secret communist smuggled in there, and Kamala Harris. So if you listen to some people, which I think is really funny, what are your general thoughts about the very sprightly, youthful Joe Biden, and
obviously fully functional Joe Biden?
What do you think about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and their administration? And I think most of their cabinets put together this so far, which is a bunch of progressive Antifa radicals in there, like everyone thought it was going to be. And I'm obviously being extremely facetious, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think Biden will be the left but competent U.S. president. So there's a lot to take on there. First of all, as a guy who's usually identified as a right-wing writer, I was very tempted to scream, "Will we have a new president?" But I didn't want to get cut out of context. Not that you would, but like down the road, like Riley says Trump will launch a coup. But I mean, so in all seriousness, what do I think of the Biden administration? I think Joe Biden's absolutely business as usual. One group of people I actually feel kind of badly for, although I enjoy trolling them online, is the actual Bernie Sanders leftists that, like the actual Trump populists, really had ideas. Yeah. Like, I don't personally, one of the few things I am left on is national health care. I mean, there's the old joke, if France could make it work, why can't we? But there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, most civilized countries have a national health care system. Our neighbors, Canada and indeed Mexico, do at least as good a job as we do. Canada has fully national health care. Yeah, so Bernie had ideas. Bernie got robbed for the second election in a row, frankly. I mean, I knew what
I would say more. I mean, yes, but definitely in 16 super delegates. But I think with this year, he just didn't grow his base, and his own base didn't go and vote for him. They didn't show up to vote.
He was that, by the way, that was a huge problem with the Bernie bros in general. I mean, I remember I was talking to an ex-girlfriend of mine who's a passionate Bernie Sanders supporter, and she kept talking about Bernie, the Republicans must have done something with the votes. How could so few people have voted for Bernie? And I went and looked up the percentage of, I guess the group would have been like urban, lower income, left-wing Caucasians that voted that year, and it was like 4%.
Yeah.
And it was like voting machines don't register, glints in a raver kid's eyes. You need to actually go in and cast that ballot. So I mean that definitely affected him. But no, I mean, like with Bernie, it's not, the word stolen's been overused on all sides of this election. The fix was definitely in, though, as a guy from Chicago, and you saw like big Jim Clyburn grinning on the podium, and then that day, like, who was it? The senator from Minnesota, Klobuchar, stepped down. Buttigieg stepped down. I mean,
yeah.
Booker, he may have already been gone, but like 3 or 4 top candidates left the race that day, and there are clips of them all shaking hands with one guy. Like, we know what happened to Bernie. But anyway, I do feel bad for the genuine Sanders leftists to some extent, Schadenfreude aside, because the Biden ticket is not. There was this weird attempt on the right. Like I've done the Ben Shapiro show a couple times. Nice guy, get along with him. But I mean, there was definitely an attempt in the right-wing media to present Joe Biden as sort of a Trojan horse through which would come communism. And people were saying things like far left, creaky Uncle Joe. And it's sort of, Biden's been a senator for 47 years. He's friends with Mitch McConnell. I wasn't buying it.
No, not at all.
It's difficult to think of two people that have locked up more black men than Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I mean, Biden wrote the 94 crime bill. Harris was a legendary prosecutor. I think they're both former prosecutors. So, I mean, when you look at that up there, I think that they'll do a competent enough job of running the country. I mean, Kamala Harris was a big state senator. Joe Biden, vice president under Barack Obama. They're further left than I'd like. But I don't see anything wild that's going to happen. The main thing that's going to happen is the continued consolidation of wealth among the elite.
Yeah.
I mean, Google Biden cabinet and then Wall Street or Goldman or Bayer if you want to get old school, and you'll see what you see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so that's pretty much what I think. I do think that one of the things that I do think that's potentially dangerous on the Democratic left, and I'm actually not at the James Lindsay or Chris Rufo level on this. I don't think wokeness on campus is the biggest threat to the country. It's incredibly annoying as someone on campus, and it does produce a new generation of activists. But I mean, I do think that a serious player like Biden is going to be very likely to say, okay, we're not implementing full national health care. We're not doing most of the things the progressives want. So we'll give them the almost meaningless stuff. And he might include in that category, say, full Equality Act transgender protections or CRT returning to the federal government, thinking that almost doesn't matter. And that would have an extraordinarily significant impact on a ton of people. So I think there's a 50% chance Biden does some things like that. And again, the next Republican president will very likely reverse them. We're not going to see the old eagle go down in flames. But those are the things that I think people do legitimately worry about from the right when it comes to Biden. But the claim that Joe Biden is going to institute communism, first of all, the president can't do that. I don't even know what that means. But like Kamala Harris is a radical left-winger. I mean, Kamala Harris does have a fairly left-wing voting record, but Biden actually doesn't. And they're both millionaires with a background in an aggressive version of the law surrounded by their friends from Goldman. So I don't see corruption beyond the usual pale or revolution going on.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Kamala Harris is a neoliberal at best. I mean, I'm not really worried about her. I think she does a lot of pandering. I agree with you about the critical race theory stuff. I think there's going to be a lot of like, okay, here you go, so you can be happy. But I don't think it's going to be broad sweeping where it's in every single, cavity of, society. And it's just going to be permeating throughout everybody's livelihoods. I think it might be a little bit in government, maybe in some districts and schools, which also is worrying, concerning for me. I don't like that. But I don't think it's going to be, widespread across the country, that kind of thing. And yeah, I think it'll be probably business as usual. I will be curious to see what the right does. If do they stick with Trump and that brand, or do they kind of, backslide into the, Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney kind of thing? Or I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what the right does. But
yeah, so I try to be dead honest in opinions from the right or the left. Trump did, so we'll get into this actually when I get into Trumpism in a second. The end of the Trump presidency was extraordinarily damaging for the Republican brand. Yeah. I mean, there's just no way around this. I mean, pulling people like Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood up on podiums and yapping about Krakens. I mean, it seemed like, and this is going on, by the way, I don't know if you're kind of in that hackery community, but this is going on along with the script kiddie boards on Reddit and 4chan, talking script kiddie in the hacker sense, by the way. Creepy stuff on Reddit, unfortunately. But I mean, like all of the sort of hacker boy boards talking about Q has probably been exposed as a 4chan troll, Q from QAnon. That's something I've long thought, by the way. When I first saw the QAnon conspiracy theory and these nonsense posts like bright red fox is trying to play a trick on Apple lady, like my impression was this is one of these clowns from Reddit or 8kun that's having fun hoaxing boomers. It looks like we now probably know that's true, whether or not that ever gets out beyond the internet community into the generality. So the combination of that with Trump sort of stumping around on Twitter saying things like they stole it, Sydney's got the data. I mean, it does make the Republicans look like a bunch of out of touch, non-internet savvy boomer rustics. And that is pretty damaging. And it to some extent, it's just funny. Like you've got the crazies on the left, too. But there's a real impact because there's that Georgia runoff race coming up.
Tuesday, right? I think it's Tuesday.
Where you've got some solid varsity players. I mean, if you don't vote Republican, you don't like them. But like Purdue, that's like Biden. He's not going to do anything except be a reasonably competent senator.
Right.
Fortune 500 business is the family background. Like this serious guy now has to deal with this nonsense in the background. Like he's actually been asked the question at an event, how do you feel about the Kraken? And you could just see the man die a little bit inside, like Mitt Romney when he tried for that cabinet position, like, bro, do I have to answer this? And he did a yeoman's job.
Right.
I mean, like if Purdue, Loeffler's not at the same level, but if they lose their seats because of this foolishness, I mean, then you're really talking political business. I mean, then you're talking about Kamala Harris as the swing vote in the Senate. It's incredible to think of the Republicans having allowed this. Like Mitch McConnell must just every night go to sleep after stabbing a Trump voodoo doll like it was Caesar. Like this fool, this parvenu, this moron. So, I mean, I think that this last stretch has been a bit bizarre. Now, with that said, where do I think the Republicans should go? No, I don't think. I think that Trump actually exposed something about the country, and it's not evil racism. We've talked about the exact percentages of bigots earlier. Right. I'm sure most of those people voted for Trump, but I'm also 100% sure that everyone who identifies as a communist terrorist didn't. So, I mean, you can't define people by their most extreme lunatic supporters. That bigotry is not hugely prevalent in modern America, at least measurably more than 10%. But I mean, I think what Trump did expose in America is that there is a hunger, and so did Bernie, for new ideas. Why don't we do things like build an absolutely standard Israeli and Egyptian style border security wall? I've never understood why that was considered a racist question. I probably wouldn't. I think immigration in many ways is good for the country, but it's a fairly standard idea internationally. Mexico got into a ton of international trouble for decades because they had that gun-mounted wall in their southern border. Yes. They kept complaining to us about illegal immigration and turning people back from like their fortified moat full of angle iron. So anyway, but I mean, like, why not do that on the right? On the left, why not national health care? These are just common sense ideas. And I think a lot of people realized, the reason we're not doing this stuff is that rich, corrupt predators are stopping us from doing this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's why there's so many Bernie votes, so many Trump votes. If the Republicans are smart, as opposed to going back to this sort of John McCain, like, I'm really rich and I might fight you perspective, what they should do is explore some of those ideas. What about merit immigration? Totally race neutral. The groups to benefit the most would be Nigerians, Japanese people, large extent the Mexican upper class. But why not? Why not do that? Give me one reason, Why do we have all those troops in Somalia? I mean, what's the reason? I mean, so the Republicans should focus on Trumpism, benefits for the American working man and woman, and they should do well, but they should do it with a candidate that knows a little more about the political system.
Yeah.
Just last line, but I mean, in terms of I like talented amateurs, like all Americans. We're the culture that invented, First Night at the Apollo and so on. But when you actually look at some of the effects of specifically the Trump presidency, I mean, a very large number of people between the last couple of Obama years when you saw the rise of Trumpism and then Trump himself are now convicted felons. I mean, serious people like Roger Stone, Michael Cohen, Dinesh D'Souza. Yeah. Like he went in there with that brash business attitude, not knowing the kind of players he was taking on, and literally got people locked up for decades. I mean, it's so bring in a player to say some of those things. Dan Crenshaw might not be bad. Nikki Haley would be good. Tulsi Gabbard's really a Republican, in my opinion.
Yes.
5 or 6 others.
Yeah.
Cruz.
But before I let you go, because this has all been great. How do you think the next year is going to be for COVID? That's on everybody's mind still, and it's, we got this new strain now. It's here in LA and Colorado. It's in Australia. It's in UK. It's in, the vaccine is apparently not getting rolled out the way it was supposed to, and then there's some, I think, legitimate concerns about the efficacy of the vaccine. And I'm very pro-vaccine. I'm very much pro-vaccine, but there are some question marks, I think, about the longevity of how it works. And there's just a lot of new kinds of, and UK is on a tier 4, tier 5 lockdown until April 1st. And, there's still a lot of heavy restrictions, and, ICUs are full. There's just so many new things of sorts with this ever ongoing, almost a year in virus. What do you think about the coming year?
I think the coming year will see a return to normal in the large majority of states and a mass population exodus from those that do not return to normal. I don't think we handled COVID particularly well. And I actually think this from the right, not from the left.
Mm-hmm.
I've written some pieces about this. One was just a popular print piece for Spike, large British men's magazine. But I also worked with Tom Donaldson's AMF Foundation, pretty serious consulting project, to look at the relationship between COVID lockdowns and unemployment, for example. That paper should still be available online. I mean, COVID-19 obviously is real, obviously is dangerous, but I think throughout the start, there was a great deal of misinformation about COVID that flooded sort of, again, mainstream, middle to up middle class discourse. And that's been very damaging in terms of the kind of panic that it created.
Yeah.
So first you had the projections. I mean, we all remember Neil Ferguson. 2.2 million people in what, as I recall, he called his most likely scenario, would die in the USA by September. You had Pueo, former top tech boss, coming in top that with 10 million. The original IFR estimates were all across the board. Ferguson's was at least 0.9. Pueo's was 4%. Even if you want to get into some of the more serious papers, you went from Ioannidis at 0.1 up to 2%. I mean, there was almost a concerted effort not to discuss who is actually most at risk from COVID.
Sure.
We've known since the first wave of Italian data came in that the average victim is 81. In the USA, it's 82. But anyway, I mean, I think there's very little evidence that large-scale lockdowns have been particularly effective. Not that I wouldn't argue that they've had some statistically significant impact on the virus, but in the sense that if you take the large number of regions as a block that simply never locked down, Utah, Iowa, Florida during the second round, move overseas, Sweden, Belarus, you could argue Japan, there's no difference in any model I've ever run between the outcomes they saw and the outcomes that the locked down areas saw. I mean, now this is probably raw numbers. I don't have the data in front of me. It's probably not proportional. But one of the hardest hit states seems to be California. Which has a full-on crazy lockdown, which has never relaxed that Gavin Newsom lockdown, which, by the way, their entire upper class is violating. Just thinking of friends I know in the state or the pictures of the governor at the French Laundry, I mean, it's pretty disgusting. But nonetheless, a formal lockdown, it's crushed small business. I don't think that's worked. So, I mean, my approach to COVID, and again, I normally don't discuss this for more than a minute unless I'm doing a piece with a medical doctor on the same panel or something. But
sure.
I am technically a boss. I might run for mayor in my city. This is what I would have done. I would really, really hard wall have protected seniors like Florida did. Like, no, you're not shipping any sick people, not just COVID sick people, back into this nursing facility. Here's a whole hotel you can have to put them in instead. Hard protections. And that would have saved a great number of lives. I don't agree with those who say Cuomo, governor of New York, killed tens of thousands of people, but it seems to be about 4,000 to 6,000 people that actually did die as a result of COVID-positive patients returning to his state's nursing homes.
Right.
There are only 35,000 COVID deaths in New York State. I mean, we're talking 15, 20% of that total caused by this one act of malfeasance. So, I mean, you protect seniors, you cancel large events. I don't know why that wasn't done very early on when you look at these politicians and executives at things like parades in Chinatown. That was crazy. This is mid-March. Mandate basic social distancing. I don't have a problem with masks. I think this is one of those things where just as a quant, like obviously if you cough into a 3-ply cotton sock, you're going to have less virus in the air than if you don't. We don't really need to get the scientists in here and see, what the R squared is and so on. But I mean, so I would have mandated masking and social distancing pretty early on. I get a lot of hate from that online, mostly from the right. canceled large events. They did that a month and a half too late. Protected seniors. They did that months too late in terms of non-medical nursing home visits and so on. Yeah. And I think had you done those three things, not had you just stayed open, but had you done those three things and stayed open, there would have been fewer deaths than there were. And I think now we know that.
Yeah, that's what I'm hopeful, that we can have a more, we know a few things, and hopefully we can have a more honest kind of engagement about how these things are, like, this works, this doesn't work, as we move into at least the first half of the year, doing things that can be, I guess, more targeted in a really helpful way. Will, you are generous with your time, and I definitely want to respect it. So tell folks where they can find you. And of course, I can put some of this stuff in the notes, but where's the best way to find you and see what you're doing and your work and all that?
Yeah, I'm pretty easily available online. I'm Wilfred Reilly on Twitter and Facebook. Nothing too original there. WILFRED REILLY. Pretty much every one of the papers, books, and so on I've mentioned. I still have some signed copies of Taboo at home that I sell to people, frankly, or give to winners of like contests online. But every one of the written pieces that I've mentioned, you can ask me about through Facebook or Twitter. That's often a better bet than searching through an entire academic record. My email, same thing. It's wilfred.riley at my college. And yeah, I look forward to interacting with people. And Javier, I enjoyed talking to you.
No, yeah, it was great. I've been wanting to talk to you for a little bit. And
is it Javier or is it Xavier?
Xavier, yeah.
Xavier, my bad.
Yeah. It's really, it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it, and you're always welcome to come back and talk about whatever, any ideas you're tinkering on or whatever. I greatly enjoy it.
Sounds good, man. We'll look forward to talking to you soon. Have a good day. Have a good New Year's.
All right, man. You as well.